Can you hear me? Yeah. Because this is always a problem when I speak somewhere. Now, I'm more than glad to come back to JNU because I shouldn't say I started teaching in JNU. I started teaching in a very small college in Calcutta, where again, probably because of political reasons, it was difficult for me to get into one of the big colleges in Calcutta. I started teaching in a college called Gurudas College, which had an invincible football team, but it was not one of the great academic colleges in Kolkata. But I started, teaching and thinking together, essentially in JNU, because JNU gave us enormous liberty in thinking about what we taught, how we taught it, etc. So it was a really very, very important and formative experience for me. So I'm always glad when I come back to JNU. So thank you for the invitation. Going back to the introduction, there's one thing about the introduction which did not please me very much, that you should not elevate people, too far in terms of, whatever they have done, and you should not have, that would be my major point today, that you should always have a critical, dialogical relationship with whoever you are reading, whoever you are listening to, whoever you are talking to. So you should do that to Hegel and Marx, you should do that to your professors, you should also do that to your friends. Because there is a sense in which we are all equal. This is not just a kind of a general expression of platitude. I think this is something that it's very hard to do, but it is also essential to do if we want to be serious in our profession. There was also, and let me make another remark, many of the remarks that I shall make against Indian Marxists, the majority of Indian Marxists also applied to me when I was in JNU. It was not that in JNU I was trying to follow Du Bois or Aimé Césaire. I had read Aimé Césaire because I enjoy reading poetry. And when I read Return to My Native Land, I realized that this was actually one of the most powerful poetic expressions of nationalism that I have ever read in my life. But I did not engage with Black Marxism. So the criticism that I make is not a criticism from which I exempt myself. And incidentally, Marxists are very good at exempting themselves from the general rules and regulations that they announce for the world. So what I'm going to do today, I want to talk about 4 or 5 things. I'm writing a paper which I think would have a title like this, Illuminations of Black Marxism. So I'm going to talk first about why I use the term illumination, because illumination here means 2 different things, as you will see. Not merely trying to understand what Du Bois's argument is, but also what Du Bois's argument can actually do for me when I'm making my argument. So illumination is linked to that. I shall make a few remarks about reading, because there's a kind of 3-layered reading that takes place when I take up Du Bois, writing about Marx. There is the writing of Marx and reading the writing of Marx. But reading is always done by somebody, who is located somewhere. So it is the reading by Du Bois of Marx, not somebody else reading Marx, but Du Bois reading Marx. And now I, with all the complexities of who I am today, because I'm also I've become intolerant of this loose use throwing around of the term location. Location is an extremely complex thing. For instance, if I ask myself, this is what I do with my students in Columbia when I teach in class. I ask themselves to think about what is my location. Because I come from a small village, a small town, not a village, in West Bengal, where I had my school education. I went to a school which was Bengali medium school, did not stop me from learning English reasonably well. And in a certain sense, some of those experiences are formative. So are they part of my location? Then I moved to Presidency College, which was intellectually, I think, a wonderful college, but it was also a college of privilege in a certain, not social economic privilege, but a certain kind of intellectual privilege. Then I came to JNU. JNU is not a place of the proletariat in India. JNU might be a place where people think about the proletariat in India, but thinking about the proletariat doesn't make you one of them, right? So it's also a place of privilege. Then I went to SOAS. I was in Oxford for some time. I went to SOAS. I now teach in Columbia. And I live in Columbia, something like an American professor, right? So what is my location? Is my location an American location in New York? Not just New York, a certain part of New York which is very privileged. Or is my location what I was in JNU or what I was when I came out of Navadvip as a student? So location is one of the most complex things to think about. And I'm irritated by the way the term location is used. So I tell them that when somebody says location, 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 they mean by that the location is important. But I mean by that location is very complex. And so you must be able to, introspection is the first step in thinking about anything. In Indian philosophy, they would very often say that, when I know something, any point of jnana, within that jnana, there is implicit what they would say a kind of pratibodha viditatva. That is, the fact that I know something includes, folded within itself, even if it's unannounced, the fact that I am the person who knows that something. So knowledge of the self is implicit in any act of knowledge, which is a big thing to say because, knowledge of the self in this sense is very crude. I simply have to be aware that I am learning this. But knowledge of the self, if you mean by that critical knowledge of the self, is something which is very hard. Because knowing the self in some ways is the most difficult thing of all. Anyway, so what I shall do is I'll talk about 4 or 5 parts of the paper that I would write. I'll talk about illuminations. I'll talk about reading. I'll talk about 3 arguments in Du Bois, mainly. And then after that, I'll mention a very small part from Aimé Césaire, which is a different kind of argument. So it's not something which attaches to Du Bois very easily. And then the implications of that for us, very briefly. I also don't want to go on for too long. So, critical thinking. Critical thinking does not mean submitting to what is called critical thinking in America. Critical thinking is critical thinking in the sense that critical thinking means your orientation to anything that comes to you from whatever source critically, right? So simply trying to write the way it is written, way social science is written about in the Ivy League universities, etc., is not critical thinking, at least in this sense. So why do I call it illumination? I'm using the term illumination in a meaning which is simple, I think also very profound, which you get in ancient Indian philosophy in many, many places. Illumination means, the term illumination in English literally means the effect of bringing a light into a place where there is no light. That is illumination. Otherwise, I would simply call light. Illumination is not light. Why illumination is not light? Illumination essentially means that light is self-luminous. Right? So in their argument, they would say that if you have a deepa, if you have a diya in your hand, bring it into a room which is dark. It's not your great advantage that you are getting to see the diya, because the diya is self-luminous. Wherever you put the fire or the flame, you would be able to see the flame. It's the nature of the flame to be seen, right? But illumination means that if you bring it into a room where there's a pot, that is a painting or something, or a ghat, that is a jar, metal jar or something like that, which I could not see because it was dark. When you bring the light into the room, that actually becomes visible. So in a sense, you could mean by illumination, this is what they mean strictly by illumination, it's a kind of visibilizing, if you use an American term. I don't like that term. It's a useful term. Making visible something which was not visible before. So I use the term illumination of Black Marxism because I think when we, who have been attracted to Marxism generally, I've been attracted to Marxism all my life. But my attraction to Marxism is very odd because there are some parts of Marx which I find sometimes, many of Marx's sayings are true, but they have now become tritely true. That is, everybody who lives in a capitalist society doesn't need Marx to understand that it is like that. There are some parts in Marx which I think are imaginative, critically very interesting, but in my view not entirely right. I think Marx said a lot of things about the state which fall, in my view, between being right and wrong, in the sense that I personally believe that's a different argument, so I don't want to go into that. I believe that in the history of capitalism existed with two forms of the state, not one. So saying the capitalist state to me is meaningless, right? Because there were two types of states which accompanied capitalism in its historical evolution. The first state I would loosely call a kind of constitutionalist state, which is the state that you get outlined and defended in Locke. Right? The state of deep inequality, but it is a state, it's a form of thinking which tries to put restraints on the power of the absolute state. So it's constitutionalist. And that's the form of the state that accompanied capitalism till about the mid-19th century. From the mid-19th century, a very big transformation started happening, which gradually culminated in the development of the modern universal suffrage-based democratic state, which is a totally different form. So I think there's no capitalist state which accompanied capitalism untransformed from the start to the end. There are at least two different forms of the state, the constitutionalist state and the genuinely democratic state, which accompanied capitalism in its two different phases. So my thinking about Marx, the truth of Marx's thinking about politics is also complex. I don't think Marx was wrong. I think Marxists were wrong in believing that what Marx truly said about the first stage of the capitalist state is also true of the second stage of the capitalist state. So my relationship with Marxism is complex in that sense. But let me turn now to the question of Black Marxism. What is Black Marxism? You can ask the question, does it make sense, or is it right to make black and white of Marxism? Is there Black Marxism there, which is different from white Marxism, right? I think it's an important question, but it goes into a very important question about reading. So let me make that point about reading very quickly, but this is the point on which we could go on for 2 hours. And this is also something on which I teach a course on what is reading and what are different modes of reading. Reading is a strange activity which, the moment it is done towards any text, right? Because reading is usually of text. At least we are thinking here of reading essentially of text. But if you think closely, you will see that reading is a strange activity which immediately reveals a kind of tension in the textuality of text, that is, what it means for something to be a text. Because in a text, inevitably, there are two sides. On the one side, there's a side of the text which aspires towards fixity. That when Marx writes something down, the workers of all countries unite, etc., Why does he write it down? Why does he simply not sort of speak to himself, feel delighted that he has got this idea, and then stop there? Because he wants to fix it. He wants to put it down so that once it is put it down, it acquires a very strange kind of fixity. Strange, because if it is not written down, human thoughts do not have the quality of that kind of perpetuity or that kind of durability. So textuality means an attempt by somebody or some people to fix the meaning of something on the one side. But reading, think of reading. Reading is somebody having a book in his hand, right? Not the author who has written the book, but somebody totally different, living sometimes in a totally different time, totally different history, picking up the book and opening it and starting to read it, right? And this is by nature, inevitably, variational. When Manindra opens a book and I open a book, we are two individuals. And we see different meanings in the book, not because we are stupid, but because we are determined by our experience of intellectual formation, right? So textuality itself is something which has two elements to it. On the one side, the element of fixity, and on the other side, the element of variation. Now, nowadays, we are very familiar with theories, philosophies, which give attention to the second side, the reading side of textuality. This variation side. For instance, you will remember arguments by Roland Barthes, who has this famous essay, which I think is an excessive essay. It's called The Death of the Author. Umberto Eco has a book which is called The Role of the Reader. So there are many people. Foucault also has a paper on the death of the author. Derrida particularly is somebody he has a famous essay which I would recommend to all of you if you're interested in textuality, which is called Signature Event Context. Signature Event Context is one of his most well-read, most widely read essays. In that he makes a point which I think is true, but which becomes an obstacle to my kind of thinking. He points to this duality of textuality, that there is an attempt to fix the meaning. In his essay, he says that, Derrida is somebody, I like Derrida for that partly, because he is a provocative thinker. So whenever he has an interesting thought, he must push it, he must present it in a way which provokes you, which also makes you think. So he says in that essay, if you've read that essay, that writing is not a form of communication. A very interesting proposition. Writing is not a form of communication. What does that mean? It means exactly what I'm saying, that there is a conceit in people who write, that it is a form of communication in the sense that this is my thought, I'm actually communicating that thought unchanged. They does not use that term, but implies it, unchanged, to everybody who is a potential reader. So he attacks that idea of the unchangeability or unchangingness of the text or the meaning of the text in that essay. But the problem is that the reason why I think this is sometimes excessive is that he emphasizes the point, which is true, that anywhere somebody reads a text, this happens. There is a variation, there is a kind of readerly variation of textual meaning. But I'm slightly troubled by that because, in saying something which is quite true, it also makes it trite, and it also makes it unusable in a certain sense, because you then say that, well, every reading is different. Of course, every individual reading is different, but I'm not concerned with every individual reading. I'm actually concerned with certain forms of collective reading. When blacks take up capital, does that change the nature of the meaning, right, or the possible intelligibility of the capital in a certain way? Now, so what happens when a black man opens a book by Marx? What happens is, minimally, I want you to think about that, minimally. Marxism is famously weak in thinking about identity, simply because Marx absolutizes a certain kind of identity, which he understood very well, which was his concern. He was not concerned about other types of identities very much, which is about the identity of class, right? But there's a tendency in Marx's exclusive focus on that to obviate, in a certain sense, the presence of other types of identities in the world. But of course, there are other types of identities, right? And so when a black man takes up capital or takes a Marx text and opens it, it immediately brings in the question of identity, which is either withdrawn or subdued or totally obscured in standard thinking by the Marxists. It immediately brings the question of identity, who reads in terms of race, in front of our eyes. So that's why I think there's a preliminary point about Black Marxism. Just the fact that it's a black man who is reading Marx, which is important, because it immediately brings in the question of identity into the problem of reading, right? So this is why I'm teaching a course. This time when I go back to New York in 20th January, I'll start teaching a course which I've taught only once before, called Reading Marx Historically. So which is 3 parts. The first part is about what Indian philosophers would say are the Purva Pakshas of Marx, that is philosophical arguments in response to which Marx's arguments are developed. So there's a long discussion about Hobbes, Locke, and Adam Smith on the one side, and there's a long discussion on Hegel and Feuerbach on the other side, because these are the Purva Pakshas for Marx. Then there's a section on Marx, and I do not spend too much of time on Marx on capitalism, because that should be left to Marxist economists. There are great Marxist economists in Columbia who can teach that. But there's a section on other aspects of Marx, and then I teach sections on Marx read outside Western Europe. But the problem is very simple. The problem is, let me give you my own example, because I'm doing it conversationally. I grew up in a small town called Navadvip in West Bengal in the 1960s. And I grew up in a family context which was very Marxist. My father was a Marxist historian. He was a very well-known, he was one of the first people to try to write history of the peasantry from a Marxist point of view. So I grew up when I didn't have an ability to judge these things independently. I grew up with the idea that, there's truth in Marx's writings, right? I said in one of my papers about P.C. Joshi that I was actually communist by caste, in the sense that I was given communist ideas essentially through the context of my family. Unlike many of my friends who grew up in upper middle class families which were very strongly anti-Marxist, and they acquired Marxism from outside. In my case, it didn't happen that way. Anyway, so I was told that there is truth in Marx. When I started reading it, it's talking about a society. The society gradually forms and becomes visible and intelligible to me. And the more it becomes intelligible, the moment I look outside the window and watch my society, the society of Navadvip, it simply cannot but strike you by the difference between what I see around me, the society which I ought to analyze and understand critically, and the text which was given in my hand. And I was told that, there's truth in this. And so how do I link, how do I relate the truth in Marx, which I take for granted? I'm not saying that it's a superstitious belief. I think there is truth in Marx. But the truth in Marx is truth about the capitalist society that he saw around him in Germany, France, etc., which is not the truth of the society I find around me. So if somebody says that, try to find the truth about your society socially, critically, and follow Marx, it's not an easy thing to do. If you're thoughtful, it's a very difficult thing to do, because the more you read, the more you see Paris of the 19th century. And the more you try to think about your society, you go out and tell yourself that every social interchange that I experience in everyday life is something that I should subject to critical examination, as Marx does for his society. The difference between what Marx has in front of him and what I have in front of me is absolutely stark. Is very, very, very clear. So, let me come back to. So, this is the problem of reading. So, I'm interested in. I acknowledge that reading is an activity which is variational, always produces variation, produces individual variation, but I'm interested in the collective variation. When blacks read Marx, in my course, I do, first I do Russian Marxism, because there are people who are outside Western Europe, because Lenin's society was not Marxist society, right? Russian Marxism, Chinese Marxism, Indian Marxism, Middle Eastern Marxism, African Marxism, sometimes if I get the time, Latin American Marxism, etc. And I want my students to think about this question that, so how is Marx read? And since Marx is read with avid curiosity by people around the world, like my father, like myself, like you, I suspect even today, what does that mean? How do we deal with the dissonance between the society that we get analyzed in Marx's Capital and the society that we aspire to analyze in our critical work? Now, so Black Marxism, I found, among the different forms of Marxism, non-Western European Marxism that I read, I found Black Marxism in some ways, one of the most profound and poignant. So let me make a couple of arguments about what I found in Du Bois. I had read Du Bois earlier, sometimes not very systematically, but with curiosity. But this time, because I was teaching a group of students, so it was my responsibility to communicate to them a kind of, acceptable, accurate understanding of Du Bois's arguments. I read it with a different kind of attention. And I found 3 arguments in Du Bois which arrested me. Remember that I'm not a black scholar, I'm not a black American, I'm not a scholar of black life or black history, I'm not a scholar of Du Bois. I'm essentially a student of Western social political thought coming from India, right? And so I cannot claim that I actually bring a great deal of special knowledge to the understanding of Du Bois from that angle. But I found 2 things in Du Bois, let us say, on which I felt that in spite of all my limitations, I could say something which was, at least from my point of view, valid. What black thinkers do with that is a different question. But my black students in Columbia responded very positively. So let me give you an outline of those 2 arguments very quickly. The first thing that arrested my attention in Du Bois was that occasionally, not always, but occasionally, and sometimes in very important argumentative circumstances, the argument is moving on, and you come to a point where you realize that the argument has come to the cusp of making a remark, which is a very important remark for Du Bois, right? And suddenly you find the use of the term caste, right? There's a book by Isabel Wilkerson which is called Caste, which is partly drawn from Du Bois, but I don't think it's a good book in many ways, but it's not a very clearly articulated philosophical argument. I think it's a powerful sociological picture of the kind of discrimination that American blacks have to face. But I think Du Bois' argument is not like that. Du Bois' argument, I think, is a powerful philosophical, technical argument. So I personally feel this is where the argument gets interesting for me from the point of view of a student of Marx. Du Bois, by the way, is a Marxist. And he is trying to understand a question which is partly Marx's question, and partly a question that Marx has in front of him, but he does not see clearly, right? It's the question of the position of the black workers in the American capitalist system, right? So what Marx sees very clearly is the presence of a group of workers who are the most disadvantaged in the system of inequality of American capitalism. You have to attend to this argument now closely, and I put my stress on the question of inequality, because I'm going to argue in a minute that what is remarkable about Du Bois's argument is he's showing us that the very powerful language of inequality, I think the most powerful language of inequality that was developed in the modern world, which comes from Marx, undoubtedly. Hegel has some understanding of inequality, Hobbes has understanding of inequality. Nobody comes anywhere near, the consistency, the power, and the force of developing a language of inequality, not just a picture, but a language of inequality, compared to Marx. I think what Du Bois shows is that language is very powerful, and it's very plausible to say that, after all, I'm trying to understand capitalism, deeply unequal economic structure in which the blacks are involved. So what is more logical than trying to understand that through the language of inequality, which I get in Marx? This is what Du Bois is doing. I think Du Bois is doing that, but Du Bois is doing something much, much more. Because Du Bois finds, because he is a black man, Marx is not. Du Bois finds that there are some points where the experience of the American black worker, right, cannot be encompassed completely by the language of inequality that Marx had developed. The language runs out, the language is exhausted. There is a surplus of experience which that language simply cannot capture, or it cannot capture very well. So you need a different kind of language. At least you need a form of writing which alerts you that you have come to the edge of a particular language, and you need, if you want to go forward from here, something which is a different language, right? And I personally feel this would be the first point in my paper, which I would try to present there, of course, with chapter and verse, with textual evidence. But the basic argument would be this, that Du Bois's use of the term caste at these crucial points shows something which cannot be understood by a conventional form of Marxism. Why? Because this is why I wanted the board. So I don't have a board, but I'll sketch something and you would be able to see. It's very tiny for you at the end, but I'll explain it to you. So this is a square, this is a rectangle, which is the rectangle of classes in American capitalist society. Very unequal. So the white, Protestant white working class in Boston is at the top. They are not at the top, sorry. The Protestant white, let's say, financial aristocracy or the bourgeoisie, they are at the top. And then you have, different layers. And at the bottom here, Marx would say, at the bottom you have the American blacks, right? You have the Irish, you have the Italians, you have all kinds of other people, right? In that hierarchy, it's a hierarchical picture. And at the bottom of this pile, you have the blacks. So this is, what is this a picture of? This is a picture of inequality, right? But remember one thing, and this will also show us a very strong connection between Du Bois and Ambedkar, because Ambedkar faces something which is very similar in our system. Similar is a misleading term. I should not push that too much. It is similar in the sense that there is similar point that Ambedkar is trying to capture about India. But let's keep to Du Bois. So Du Bois basically says that this is actually not a correct picture of the position of the blacks in American society. The diagram should be changed. The diagram should be, there should be another rectangle, right, which is lower, but which is separate. Why is it separate? Because black and white society, they do not communicate. They do not exchange social communication. So exactly in Ambedkar's sense, Ambedkar says the Hindus have no society. Right? Same point. We did not go into the ideological sides of it, just sociologically, purely sociologically. So Du Bois basically says that, this is something which is caste-like. This is not a matter of class. If the American blacks had been here, and that would have been all, then of course it would have been just a matter of class, right? So American society cannot be captured in terms of the language of class, right? And here again, I find it very interesting because there is something that happens in Ambedkar. Ambedkar himself is not always very conceptually clear about this point. At least he does not. He is a very clear-headed thinker. But I don't think he actually does enough with that, which is the distinction why in India it is not enough to use the term social democratic, that is, making democracy social, in the same sense in which Marx uses the phrase making democracy social. Remember, Marx's movement was called social democracy, right, in Europe. Why? Because Marx is using the term social with a meaning which is equivalent to the meaning of economic. For Marx, social democracy is for Marx, social and economic are more or less interchangeable in this phase of his thinking. And I think what is interesting about Ambedkar is that he realizes that if you do not make a distinction between the economic and the social in India, you cannot understand, you cannot capture, the essence of the experience of caste. It is not inequality in the ordinary sense, because you can live in a deeply unequal society, right? The Irish or the Italians, the Sardinians, the Poles who came to, I live in New York, there's a part of New York which is called Hoboken. It's just across the river on the other side in New Jersey. That was the place for the debris of American capitalism. That is, any people who came in who were dirt poor, who couldn't go anywhere else, they always started in Hoboken. So the Irish came to Hoboken. I think the Italians came to Hoboken. Initially, Hoboken is a name which is a Dutch name. So the poor Dutch built Hoboken. Then they moved out. Italians came. Then the Irish came. So the poorest of the poor always came to Hoboken, right? But what Du Bois is saying is that, that picture of inequality is not enough, because all these people were actually part of the circuitry of social exchange, right, in American society, which is not true of the blacks, because they are part of an extremely coercive, violently protected system of non-interchange, non-exchange between the black and between the black and the white society. So what Du Bois is saying is that the economic picture, in a certain sense, captures these two together in abstract economic relationships, because obviously the American economy depends very heavily on the labor of this part, right? So it is not that the American society does not need the labor or doesn't use the labor. So economically, this is the structure of American society. But sociologically, this is why it's essential to make a distinction between the social and the economic. The economic cannot do the conceptual function of the social. Socially, these two societies are segregated. So this is something that I'm going to point out in the paper, to say that the use of caste in Du Bois is not rhetoric, because even the black authors sometimes, not sometimes, usually, think that it's a rhetoric. In fact, it is simply trying to show how deep the inequality is. My point is that it's not how deep the inequality is. My point is that Du Bois is trying to show that there's something which is over and above, beyond, surplus, whatever you want to put it, way you want to put it. That is not inequality. in the economic sense. So that is when he uses the term caste. So this is the first point in my paper. The second point in my paper would be Du Bois also uses a phrase regularly for which he became famous. I'll give you a history in a few sentences of that concept. It's the color line. Du Bois starts saying very early in his development of his analysis of American capitalism that American society is marked by the existence of a color line, obviously. But remember, a color line, two colors, two races, and a line, singular, a line, between the white and the black, right? So this basic template of American society, right, does not admit of the presence of any other race. So it's a stark division, a color line, singular color line, between black and white. This is what he starts out with, and then this is not very difficult to establish or sustain. Then he says something which I think is very interesting. And in a sense, I'll say something slightly wicked in this context, that all of you who want to go to the United States, become scholars, etc., you must understand, you must keep this in mind. This is why I asked you that, there's a choice between white Marxism and black Marxism. So Du Bois says that, of course, that is not the end of the history of migration in America. America started with whites and blacks, no one else in the middle. And he thinks, in this case, there's a spectrum in which on the one side you have the whites, and on the other side you have the blacks, who are, let's say, 20% at that time, 80% on the other side. But that is not the end of migration in America. So from the middle of the 19th century, you have the Chinese, Japanese, you have all kinds of people from other races coming into the United States and settling into the American society with different degrees of disturbance, ease, etc. Then he comes to the most explosive argument, which puts somebody like me immediately to shame in a certain sense. So he says, whoever comes into American society has to face, either an individual or a collective or a group, has to find a place in this continuum, right, between the white and the black, right? But there is a white-sided conduct, right? Conduct. That is how you carry yourself, what you try to be, how you live, how you dress, and things like that. Which school you go to, which university you attend, right? So any group which comes into the United States through later migration must find a place in this continuum between the white side and the black side. And every race which comes into the United States later actually wants to crowd into the white side and leave the black side, right? So when we go to the United States, we might, of course, in our letters home, we might say that, I've come here to be in Harlem and join the struggle of the blacks, etc. But we essentially join the struggle of the whites. I have colleagues in my university who would all the time, remind us that America is a settler colonial society, which it is. But I'm troubled by that because I ask myself, I ask them also sometimes that, of course it's a settler colonial society, but which side of the settler colonial society am I on? I do not live like an ordinary poor black in American society. I haven't come there with the aspiration to do that, right? So the society might be settler colonial, and my simply saying a sentence that, it's a settler colonial society, I condemn it. I don't think people like Du Bois would be charmed by that. People like Du Bois would be even slightly persuaded by that, right? But the important point is, and I said that I feel ashamed sometimes because when I talk to Indians who have migrated to the United States, this is absolutely palpable, because everything that they try to do want to show you that our color might not be as white as the whites, but basically we are whites, right? So you try to do everything to go to the white side, of that. It is not the color line. The color line dividing between the white and the black. And you always try to go into the white side of the color line. The whites might not allow you to do that completely, but it's true from the side of your aspiration, right? So this is a second point about the color line. But I want to make a couple of more points very quickly. What's the time now? Okay. Du Bois in his life, if you read his biography, in one sense he has a very successful life, because he is one of the first great political theorists, social theorists, intellectuals from the black side. So obviously he has an enormous influence in the black community, and gradually among the people who are liberals, among the whites, people who want to really change American society, Du Bois becomes increasingly important. And I think just as in our country, there is a continual process of the expansion of the influence of Ambedkar in some ways. Sometimes I do not think it is very useful, but in some ways it is very central. And that is essentially because of the salience of caste in our society. So with time, the stature of Ambedkar has increased. And I think similarly, when you look at the development of American social theory, the stature of people like Du Bois, many other American writers, and other black writers like Aimé Césaire, who is not American, he is from Martinique, and he is a French poet. I'll talk about him very briefly at the end. So his stature has constantly increased. But during his time, he faced difficulty, because initially, after saying that the problem with blacks would never be resolved in America if it is left only to the blacks, because American society can be changed only if a sufficient part of the white society can be persuaded that by the degradation of the blacks is American society which is degraded. And so therefore, it is the task of the whites as well to try to end the degradation of the blacks. So the question of the blacks is not just a mere black question. So when he said that, there were some black intellectuals who did not agree with him. They thought that he was being too optimistic, etc. Gradually, he wanted to make another addition to his position, to which there was a lot of pushback, both from black intellectuals and from American intellectuals, including liberals. He started saying that the color line is not just the problem of the United States. The color line is actually the great problem of the modern world because of colonialism. Because by that time, he thought that the black movement in America should try to make common cause with the anti-colonial movements in Africa, initially in Africa, because there's a common link of blackness, right? And gradually, after some time, he went a step forward and started saying that no, the color line is the line between colonialism and people who are the victims of colonialism in many, many different types of contexts, right? So the color line is not just the problem of the American blacks or the Africans vis-a-vis Europe. The color line is a world problem. So because of that, he showed a lot of interest. Gandhi, of course, was always a very great figure for the black movement in America. But he showed a lot of interest in Nehru, showed a lot of interest in people like Nkrumah and others. So he actually saw the anti-colonial movement as a kind of extension of the argument about the color line. Now, in this, there was a lot of opposition. Many people said that you are wasting your time. Many people said that it is not the same problem and don't get involved in things that we do not understand. But he stuck to that. And I personally believe that that is also a very, very important question. So let me end by making a couple of remarks. on that, and and Aimé Césaire. Aimé Césaire is in some ways a very similar intellectual because he's black. He's from Martinique, but he is subjected to a colonial intellectual process which is very specific, because French imperialism is quite different from British imperialism in some ways. So the French, wherever they went, they always said that people of the colonies are part of France, and so therefore there is a kind of gesture of inclusion, which was very helpful for people who were the elites, and also people. Remember that the French, like the Chinese, were also great believers in an exam system. It's in a kind of true meritocracy, that not from social, people should not come from social wealth or economic wealth. They should be intellectually, which is the Napoleonic idea, of merit, career open to talent through exams and things like that. Now, Aimé Césaire became one of the greatest recognized black poets writing in the French language. So if you read that wonderful collection, the introduction to that collection, the collection was called Black Orpheus. So this was the first collection, anthology of black poets' poetry in the French language, brought out in Paris with a lot of fanfare, and with a really flamboyant introduction by Sartre. And if you're interested, read the introduction to the Black Orpheus by Sartre, in which he not merely welcomes, he actually celebrates the black voice in the French language. And Aimé Césaire emerges as one of the most important figures in that poetic movement. But what I find interesting about Aimé Césaire is a different thing. Of course, he is amazingly eloquent in French, but if you read his poetic autobiography in a certain sense, Return to My Native Land, there are certain passages, the most powerful passages, are passages where he says something like this. In fact, he grew up in a small shanty town on the side of the sea. There was a beach, but the beach was a completely degraded beach. The beach was not a place where people came for recreation. The beach was the place where things which were discarded, thrown into the sea, let's say, not a pair of shoes, but a single shoe, which was thrown into the sea, comes back as refuse and finds a place on the beach. So it is this kind of degraded beach, where he grew up. And you should read his anguish in the Return to My Native Land, where he is constantly playing two things. On the one side, his return to his native land almost as a betrayer, as somebody who has become amazingly eloquent in the language of the colonizer. So he's recognized by the greatest French poets as a great French poet. But the interesting thing is that he says that there is also something in my return to my native land, which is like the washing back into the shore of this shoe, which is tattered, degraded. So my coming back as a great recognized French poet has an element in it, which is an element of this kind of colonial degradation. Because I could not find eloquence in the language of my people. Remember, we are now actually coming close to our kind of predicament. Because, Césaire's people did not have the kind of language that we have, highly developed regional languages, it's a different kind of culture. And so there's a lot of lamentation in Césaire, in thinking. I'm coming back to the point where I started about the question of self-awareness, trying to understand who I am, who one's self is, and his rediscovery of the self, his return to my native land, is also marked by the anguish that he cannot return to himself in a certain sense. So he returns as a celebrity. He does all that he could, because he became a member of the French, National Assembly, and tried a lot, did a lot about Martinique. But there's a constant refrain that, I have, in becoming a celebrated French writer, I have, in some peculiar sense, betrayed my people, betrayed my language. This should not be my language. There should have been a language in which I would have been eloquent, right? Not being eloquent in the language of the colonizer. So he goes into a different kind of line. And when I read Du Bois closely, because every time I teach the course, I go back and read the text again, because if it's a generative text, very often when you come back, I've found that all my life reading Hobbes, who is one of my favorite political theorists, I always like reading him, Hobbes or Hegel or Marx, any of these big writers, every time you come back, I'm quite old now and I have read these people for the last 50 years, and every time with close attention. But I'm surprised that every time I come back, to these writers, I get something new, something that I did not discover before. So Aimé Césaire is like that. So when I did this course on Black Marxism, I started asking this question. Maybe accidentally, I was also reading stuff from Kashmiri philosophy, where this question of the ghata and the pata, etc., and the vyanjana meaning, bringing a light somewhere, and then it's making things which were invisible visible now. That was very central. So I started asking myself that, is there something that this visibilizes for me in my own formation? In my own formation meaning, own is not a purely personal pronoun here. Own essentially means the kind of intellectual that I was, I still am. But I still have life in the sense that I'm still alive and I still have some time left to me. And if I'm self-aware, what is the direction that I should take with what I can, small ability that we have. And I then felt that Du Bois and Césaire, they gave me two different things to think about Indian society. One is this question of caste in Du Bois and the distinction between the social and the economic and what it enables us to see about Indian society. I think Ambedkar was actually making a very similar point, that the labor of the untouchable is constitutive in the economic reproduction of Hindu society. But at the same time, Hindu society is able to cut off, completely segregate the social life of the untouchable, right? So the distinction between the economic and the social that works in case of Du Bois, I think it also works in the case of Ambedkar. Ambedkar actually started doing this before Du Bois, I think, in some ways, because his basic question is the question of caste. But then I felt that, Aimé Césaire also shows me something. And during COVID, when I could not get out for 6 months, I decided that what I can do without having the kind of celebrity that Césaire had as a French poet, what I should do is I should try to think the thoughts that I do in my English writing in Bengali, which is the language which is close to me, open to me, and I haven't used for nearly 40 years without any degree of seriousness. So I wrote out a book during COVID on Marx. It has a slightly poetic name because I think eventually my reading of Marx is that Marx is a poetic thinker in some ways. It's called, in Bangla, it's called Marx to Shorger Shondhan. That's Marx and the Search for Paradise. And so I wrote that out slowly, put it together eventually into a book. And since then, I have actually started writing at least 3 papers every year for 3 different journals, which are all edited by my friends from my college days. And I have found, this is the last remark I'll make. I'll give you an example. In one of the classes I was teaching, I was trying to comment on the term, which is an awkward term in English, even now, otherization. Others and otherization, the process by which we make somebody an other. And I simply started thinking that, if I wanted to do this in Bangla, how would you do it? I found that in Bangla, we have Ami, which is I, Amra, which is we. And if I want to have an opposite of we, Amra, it's hard in Bangla to get a word which has the kind of malignant ferocity that the term other has come to have today, right? The Muslims to the Hindus, Hindus to the Muslims, the relation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. There is something to the use of that term other, otherness there, which is violent, which is fierce, which is remorseless, and which gives the impression that, the existence of the other itself is a threat to my existence. So I found that, that kind of violent term is difficult to find in conventional Bangla. And I once did an experiment in my class. I was sitting around a table, not with this number of people, about 30 people. And I said that if I were doing this with you in Bangla, I would have said that this is Amra, that is me and two people with me. And these people are Era, these people. You can see that it becomes difficult to translate into English. Era. What would you say in Hindi? Ye log, right? Ye log. Era. On the other side of the table, Ora, wo log. And people who were members of the class but had not turned up on that day, but could, they are Tara, right? They. How would you do it in Hindi? Because you will have to say wa for both. Both the earlier example and this example, right? Now, but in Bengali we can easily do era ora tara. And when you do era ora tara, you can immediately see that, the process of differentiation in language, that somebody who is different from me in language, works differently if you go into a different language. And I got this from a lecture from a friend of mine, my colleague at Columbia who has just retired. I would recommend his work to all of you. His name is Suleiman Bashir Dayan, Diagene. Suleiman. It's a Frenchified name, Suleiman. So he would write Souleymane. Suleiman Bashir, Bachir. Dayan is Diagene. He had a very well-known book on Iqbal, but he's basically a philosopher who thinks about French philosophy and African Islamic philosophy. So in one of his lectures, he said that modern African philosopher has said that sometimes we should do this experiment when we are thinking about a problem which is a real, genuine, difficult problem for us. We should, if we know another language well, we should simply do an experiment of asking ourselves, if I were doing this in that language, how would the argument turn? So I simply took it from Bashir's lecture, and Bashir's reference to this other African philosopher. And it turned out quite differently. And I asked my students, because the advantage in teaching in Columbia is that you get students from all over the world. So people who spoke Arabic, people who spoke Swahili or Wolof from Africa, many of the others actually said that it is hard for us to find this kind of a hard description of otherness in a single word. So I'll end by saying that, so the illumination for me, coming from reading Du Bois and Aimé Césaire, is, how white my reading of Marxism was when I started reading it. It's not a great sin in the sense that we are all constituted by our history. What is sinful or what is wrong is not to try to overcome that when you are aware of the limitations that it imposes on you. So how white my Marxism was, what are the great resources that I can get if I can break that border and go into a more respectful reading of Black Marxism, and how many of my limitations and many of my blindnesses were actually revealed to me through this illumination. That is, when I read Du Bois, I understood not merely what Du Bois argued and the reaches of his thinking, but also the limitations of my own. Thank you.